Well, as Randy promised, part of my story would be evident as I walked out. So I'm going to tell you that story today, but I'll also say that I understand that we all have stories, that I'm not alone in this, and I humbly offer up what I've gone through in my life as I felt called to make some purpose from my pain. But I also want to encourage you all to share your stories with others too, because I'm just one voice, and I hope, again, humbly, you can take something away from my story today that might help you in just a little bit. And this is also the first time I've done this talk. It's not the same thing I did in my TED Talk, because I wanted to make this special for Westside and something I've thought about for a long time. So I begin. So as I mentioned to you before, or as Randy mentioned, I did this TED Talk that really talked about what it was like to end up with these legs. The pictures here on the screen will show you that I, of course, was not born this way. I had, the legs that God gave me originally for my first 36 years of life. These pictures were taken a month before that I had the accident that I'm going to tell you about that led me to stand here the way I am today. This is my husband and our kids in Florida on a vacation, and looking back at these photos, there are things that I didn't even think about that day that I took for granted that I could never do again, such as just casually walk in the sand barefoot, play with my daughter, things that I couldn't do a month later and I still can't do to this day. These pictures were from 2013. So just a month later, we were at a lake trip, a weekend trip with friends, when a freak accident happened that essentially resulted in a boat running over me. In the simplest, most graceful way I can say it is, I briefly danced with the propeller that left me with the legs you see here today, an amputated left leg, a right leg that has been through a lot of surgeries, and I was grateful to be able to keep, and then a right arm that was quite lacerated. So in that story and in that day, where freak things happen, right? Things that you can never see coming. That's just how life goes. And that day when the boat ran over me, I, of course, did not see it coming. Again, it was a series of freak things that led to this accident. But I do remember being trapped under that boat. And the first thing I thought was, oh my gosh, what is happening? Your brain can't keep up with the situation. And this was probably the course of 10, 20 seconds. But I remember it so vividly. I remember thinking about things like noticing that the bottom of the boat was white. Your brain is just on overdrive. But the most distinct thing I remember, and it was so clear, was my kids were 2 and 4 at this time. So I remember thinking, I don't want to leave my kids without a mother. And I remember everything that happened in the rest of the day and everything I'm going to tell you. Every detail is seared into my brain. But the one thing that I don't remember is how I got out from under that boat. So I always tell people, I know that God pulled me out from under that boat because I only had one limb that was not, affected by the propeller. And it was 50 feet deep of water, even though it was near a dock. And so as I was treading water, and God had saved me, nobody knew the extent of my injuries, my husband included, but when they pulled me out on the dock, I remember everybody looked at me and I looked at my body one time. And I knew I couldn't look again. And so I just had this little vantage point out of my upper left kind of peripheral vision. There was a blue summer idyllic sky. As we waited on these volunteer paramedics, we were in a remote area of Arkansas, Beaver Lake. I'm sure some of you have been there, being fellow Kansas Cityans. But anyway, as I waited on these paramedics, I continued to ask my husband and my friends over and over again, do you think I'm going to die? Do you think I'm going to die? These things looked really bad. And I remember that the responses were completely things like, no, you're going to be fine, you're going to be fine. This one guy who was an engineer, I remember he said, well, you're actually not losing a lot of blood, so you're probably going to be okay. Different ways to answer the same question. But anyway, these paramedics show up, beautiful volunteers who got me up the hill to an ambulance that was going to take me to a field where there was a helicopter waiting for me. The first of many miracles I've experienced in my life is to have access to that helicopter. But as I hopped in the ambulance, I found out later that the guy that I was put in there with, and it was just me and him, they wouldn't let anyone else in there, my husband had to follow behind. I found out later again that he was the first time he'd ever had a call, he was a brand new EMT, was me, that night, first shift. So I get in there with him and I say my repeated question, do you think I'm going to die? And he looked at me and he said, I really don't know. So say a prayer for this young man. I'm sure I was very scarring to him when he was trying to do something amazing in this world. But I was life-flighted to Springfield, Missouri, where this picture was taken the next day. So this was Sunday morning. I thought we would be driving home to pick up my kids from my parents' house. By the way, today is my mom's birthday. Happy birthday, Mom, tuning in online. But that was not how the day went. I was woken up, intubation tube was removed, and I was informed that to save your life, we had to amputate your left leg. Your right leg has been severely injured. We don't know what's going to happen with it, and your right arm has had lacerations, but should eventually, through some surgeries, be functional again. So yes, I'm smiling in this photo, and my husband always says it was morphine. But I really believe that that was the first time I learned about this word perspective from a different point of view, because remember, the only thing that I wondered was, am I going to die? And I woke up and I didn't die. So I had my first lesson on this idea of perspective. I also said something that day that I'd never even thought of before, and looking back, I think it was, again, God planting a seed to me. But to try to make my parents, who had driven through the night, my husband, my friends that were there, including our friend, a very responsible boat driver who was involved in the accident, I said to them, you guys don't worry, I'm going to write a book and become a professional speaker, and I'm only going to have to work like 1 day a month. And they were all, of course, in extreme shock and didn't find any humor in that. But I think I was trying to make them feel better. I was also in shock. But again, I think I had this seed that was planted in me. And so I started to water that seed and think about that. But before I did that, I got another stark lesson in perspective. I was looking at my phone while lying in the hospital bed, getting all the crazy things you have to get when you have the injuries that I had. And I was looking at the pictures, and this picture was taken the day of the accident of my husband and I. And man, I had a different perspective. When my friend took this picture, I remember the only thing I thought was, do not take a photo of me in a swimsuit and do not post this on social media. Like, please, give me rights to edit it. Only zoom in on the heads and the lake behind you. Like we all do. We all think about things, judge ourselves. I definitely was judging, what I perceived to be a less than perfect body. And then I looked at it 48 hours later, and all I saw was 2 legs that worked, which was God's original design for me. And again, it was like perspective hitting me in the face that I was so longing for, that body that worked. And so I continued to learn all of these lessons on perspective. But if I'm being honest, like all things, I went through my own version of the grieving process, and things were really hard. I went from being, somebody who would go to work on Monday to somebody who was now out of work for a period of time. My husband went from being a husband to being a caregiver. My kids and I, had to learn how to deal with all these new situations. My daughter, I just started potty training her, and now I couldn't even get into my own wheelchair. Again, one arm that was working. It was a really challenging and dark time. And I remember at the time just trying so hard to figure out how I can think about giving some of this to God. And I wasn't very good at it. I still wanted to have full control of everything. But every night, I would just offer up this simple prayer that you've heard before. I would say, don't worry about anything. This verse was key to me. Instead, pray about everything, tell God what you need, and thank him for all he has done. So I would say, thank you that propeller didn't hit my vital organs or my head. I would think about somebody who I knew from work who actually passed away at that same lake a week after me. I remember thinking, while I would say this prayer, those are the things that I'm so thankful for. I'm thankful for my family, my support system. And I would say, please take all my worries, because I would lie there and I would worry, I'm never going to be able to pick up my daughter again. We'll probably never be able to travel. I can't play baseball with my son anymore. I would go through all of these cycles and assumptions. But I would try desperately to just use this verse to shut off my brain. I was 50-50 on my success rate on that. But looking back now, I was planting seeds and trying to grow as a person and grow in my faith. Fast forward, the accident was in 2013. This was in 2017, the TED Talk Pastor Randy just mentioned. I had become really obsessed with that seed that was planted in the hospital to become a speaker, never done this before outside of work-related needs, or to write a book. So I did the speaking thing first, and I did a TED Talk, and it was such a cool night. And I felt like it was one of those things where I'd finally gotten used to having a prosthetic. My other leg had been miraculously healed with some crazy surgeries. And so I thought, okay, just like you might get up and put on your glasses in the morning, I get up and put on my leg, and life was normal for me. So I thought I'd put a period on the sentence, overcomer, check, let's get back to life. But that's not how life always works. So it was quote unquote normal for a while. But again, another lightning bolt struck. These pictures are taken from 2021, post me doing my TED Talk. The one on the left was when I really started to notice something was happening to me. We had gone on a vacation, the four of us and our family, South Dakota, Montana. We did Jackson Hole and Yellowstone, this big road trip. And while we were there, I was discovering that I was really having trouble breathing. And I started to think, well, this is altitude, we're in the mountains. Or I thought, I've been working from home, I just got really out of shape, and I normally am a little slower anyway than the average bear. But deep down, I knew this was different. So I got home, went to some doctors, went to some regular appointments, and nothing was wrong. Nothing's wrong. Maybe go see a pulmonologist, in a few months, blah, blah, blah. And I found out later that the condition I was diagnosed with is so rare that it takes the average person a year to get diagnosed. So no wonder people weren't figuring this out. Well, anyway, I continued to push because I would feel fine on certain days, and other days I would feel really, really out of breath, and my heart would race. And so one night I walked myself into a local emergency room. They did all the tests, and again, everything looked fine. A few days go by, feeling normal, and then again, feel like I hit the wall. And so my husband said, why don't you call John? John is a friend of ours. I met at K-State. I went to K-State. He went to KU Med. And I called him. He's a cardiologist here in town. And I said, I'm really struggling and no one can figure out what's happening. He said, come on in. He got me in right away, did all these tests on my lungs and heart. And then he called me and told me that my diagnosis that he had figured out was essentially, I'd had an autoimmune disease for a long time, but it was really kind of benign. But we've found out since, there's a handful of people I've discovered that had this same situation where it manifested and attacked my lungs. And so all the little blood vessels around your lungs that are like little hoses that oxygenate the blood had started to just close. And some days they would be open and some days they'd be closed, hence the variability in my condition. It was called pulmonary hypertension, and that also created all this pressure on my heart. I was diagnosed right around Christmas, and they told me my heart was 3 sizes too big, and I told my kids, I'm like, you guys, I'm the opposite of the Grinch. But while I was in the hospital and taking this nether pill and literally and dealing with all of this, they said, well, there is this miraculous thing that has been invented. It's a whole other story, but this woman had invented this medicine that you can see a picture of my husband mixing. We had to mix it at home through a sterile process every 48 hours. It was this crazy thing. And it would be administered through a pump that was the size and the weight of a brick. And that brick had a tube that would thread through my jugular, and it would give me little nanograms of medicine to open up those blood vessels. So I had that for a few months. I thought that was going to work. And then I was told, we're sorry to tell you that not only do you have a rare condition, you also are a rare response, that this medicine isn't working well enough for you. And so I found out what I had in December, and in April, after a few months on this medicine, I was told, the only way you can stay alive is to seek out a double lung transplant. I'd never even maybe thought of that, let alone heard of that. It was a very shocking thing to hear. And so from there, we went to the hospitals, did all the tests, and again, since we don't offer lung transplants in Kansas City, we went to all the major places. My husband and I were on the road, and my breathing was getting worse, my heart was getting worse, and it was so hard. And a friend sent me this card, and I just took this picture actually the other day. It's still in my bathroom, because I would read it every day. I just needed to know that maybe God would help me get through this, because my circumstances, I was just told over and over and over again how dire things were, and it was so incredibly challenging. And I would imagine myself during this phase, just like in that hospital bed, where I feel like God planted that seed in my mind that I'm going to write a book and become a speaker. One of the things I imagined were these beautiful lungs like you see on the screen. Maybe working at Hallmark, the art was appealing to me. But I specifically started to imagine, as I would try to think of this hope and that God could save me, was for some reason I would have these pink neon outline lungs, because I've done speaking things since my amputation, and you can see my legs, but you can't see your lungs. So I would imagine these pink neon lines outside of my lung cavity. And in this vision, I was actually speaking right here at Westside. And so as I thought about that, I have to show you. I made the shirt. That's the vision. I bought this shirt off Etsy. I painted it pink. And I thought, all right, God, I'm going to stand on that stage at Westside, and I'm going to show that seed you planted in me came true. because with God, all things are possible. Thank you. And so this is a miracle that I'm forever thankful for my organ donor. Only thing I know, I've written his family a card, but all I know is that he was a 39-year-old male. And so there are no gender differences between lungs. And so this was a major miracle. It's very hard to get a lung transplant. It's very hard to get accepted. There's not very many that happen compared to other kinds of transplants. And so it's a meta miracle in and of itself. There are so many small miracles as well to get me to this point, to get to the right place, to have a profile. The only thing you have to get matched, if you will, is your height. And so I am 5'9", which is very average between a man and a woman. Again, you can have male or female lungs as your donors. I had to have a specific blood type. Well, not a specific blood type, but I have a general blood type to get high on the list, which I do. And they said, you're probably going to have a really difficult antibody profile because you've A, had children, B, had a blood transfusion, amputation. Miracles, I got back my test and I had an incredibly low antibody profile. So I got my transplant within 6 months of my diagnosis. A, because I was so sick, but B, because of just all of these miracles. And so from that, I will tell you that I learned so many things. And a few things that I've learned, again, were some of the things that I had to learn on my own and were just kind of gritty lessons. Like this idea of perspective really came to me after the pictures in the hospital, after realizing I didn't die. This was a year after the amputation, and one of those days when I thought, okay, I've learned something big today. We were in San Diego. We had a goal to take our kids to the beach. No boats, but we wanted them to see the beach. And it was something we looked forward to in between visits and all kinds of terrible surgeries. And so you can tell I wasn't very mobile, by the way, because I laughed that I put a floaty and a life jacket on my daughter. But while I was sitting there at the beach that day, instead of thinking about sunscreen or lunch or what you might be thinking about, all I was thinking about was I had this other leg in my beach bag. So my normal prosthetic leg is a wonder of technology. It's got an electronic ankle that senses terrain like your God-given ankle does. It's got a vacuum pump that adheres it to my body. But that requires electronics. I mean, I plug in my leg every night like a cell phone. When I go to a hotel, I need like 5,000 chargers. And with that, it's not waterproof. And so the guy who makes my leg, my friend Matt, his job title is a prosthetist. Do with that what you will. But Matt told me, he goes, you're going to have to buy this fancy water leg. It's expensive, blah, blah, blah. Just borrow this for your trip to the beach. So while I'm sitting there changing out this wood with plastic shell, no electronics, but with an Allen wrench, thinking, how did this become my life? You know, I had a little fun with it that day. I was finally out of the house and not trapped in all of these appointments. And so I took a picture of my feet. And I don't know why everybody does this on beach trips, but I did. And so all anybody could comment on, though, was the toenail polish, which I thought was really funny. But what they didn't understand is before I put that foot in my beach bag, I just painted it right on the table. It's like super easy to paint a prosthetic foot. But anyway, this is the social media version, right? The cute picture. But we all know that's not the real story, right? You just share the shiny parts. And so when we got back to the hotel that night, I was in such pain from trying to walk on this thing in sand. I was still healing. I was so sad and so mad and so why me? And I remember all I noticed on the beach that day was everybody else's working legs and feet. You guys know this, when you want something, you see it everywhere. And I thought, why is this happening to me? And so I went in the bathroom and shut the door to take a shower so my husband and kids didn't have to see me be sad, because this was like the one fun thing we'd done in a year. And I cried my eyes out. And I remember saying out loud to myself things like, okay, you got to will yourself into a new perspective. So I said, what's going right? I acknowledged out loud by myself in the shower that I got to be on vacation. That was no small thing at the time, and no small thing for a lot of people. I remember thinking, okay, I'm taking a stand-up shower, which I can't do. Again, my leg is not waterproof, and you have to wash the part that goes into the leg. So the more I thought about these things, I started to realize you can change your perspective. And so I continued to learn these things. I learned other things, like how to be resourceful. My kids sleep upstairs. My husband and I's room is on the main floor. When I was in a wheelchair and couldn't walk upstairs, it was so sad to not be able to put them to bed at night. But again, the simplest things oftentimes are the most resourceful. So I found if I would just hoist myself on the floor out of my wheelchair and crawl up the stairs, we called it the crab crawl, We had a song. I got to rock my daughter to bed at night and read a book to my son, which was some of the only joy that I would have in those very dark days before I would go to bed and say that prayer to try to shut off my brain. I've also learned to have some resourcefulness in ways that are very difficult and to frankly just not be embarrassed about other people see you struggle. This was during the lung journey. These tanks represent the inventory I needed for 1 week when I left the house. I'd gotten that sick. I had this machine at home that I could always use, but I needed more oxygen than a little bag would suffice. So this is what I would get for 1 week to leave the house. And my son had a baseball game. I would go with my oxygen tanks, get a ride from the golf cart. Somebody would help me because I didn't know how many more things I would get to go to. Things were declining quickly. Most people have those little carts at the baseball fields with like sandwiches and bats and normal things. Nope, I had my oxygen tanks. But you do what you have to do. And so I also learned to have some fun along the way. I like to mess with people, sometimes like I put the cactus against my metal leg. I'm like, you guys, I can't feel it. Or my vacuum pump sounds like a phone buzzing, and in a work meeting, people will say, like, who's got their phone on, annoying eyes. I'm like, you guys, it's just my leg. And everyone's like, oh, okay, no problem, gotcha. So, you gotta have a little fun through your challenges as well. But I did eventually write that book. I told you I did the talk, check, that seed that was planted, and the other seed, notice the shirt I have on. This was my way to kind of give my wink back to God for that vision he gave me. And I had my publishing deal, I was halfway through my book before my lung journey. I was just writing it about what I had learned through my amputee journey. And I said God wanted the book to be better and give me more content. So I did finish this particular book. I could tell you all the other things that are in the book about resilience and vulnerability and perspective and all that stuff, but the biggest thing I want to share today, of course, as we're gathered here at Westside, is that I realized, and I realized this even more in my lung journey, that believing and having faith and trusting God was the only way that I could get through. I reached a point where, even though the leg thing was hard, it wasn't facing mortality every day. It was facing adaptation. But as I got sicker and sicker, I learned some really valuable lessons about things we hear all the time, like, give it to God. You can say that, but how do you do that? Or have faith. Once again, I thought I had faith, but I had reached a limit beyond myself. And so one of those times was in this wheelchair here, where I was, first of all, getting a little bit of sun when I hadn't had any sun in many days. And I look at all of these pictures, and I remember it's even hard for me to look at them because it was so incredibly challenging. But one of those days when I was in one of the 50-plus nights I had in 1 year in the hospital, and often alone, because I wanted my husband and my kids to, again, be doing some normal things. I didn't want everyone sitting in the hospital with me. My parents, my sister, friends, family, people were there all the time. But you're still inevitably alone a lot. That's just how it goes, no matter how wonderful your support system is. And mine's pretty wonderful. And one night when I was in a hospital bed, and I'd reached that point, Pastor Jonathan talked a couple of weeks ago about you do reach a point where you can no longer handle things yourself. And I was at that point. I remember I was desperately praying, please, God, help me. Give me some sort of hope and sign and peace. And we talk about the God meets you at your point of pain. And that night, out of nowhere, I started to hear this song lyric in my head over and over and over again. And it was just saying, you're a little messed up, but you're all right. And I thought, are you kidding, God? Did you send Kenny Chesney here to tell me that I'm going to be okay? I mean, I pretty much only listen to country music, so he had to work with what he had. Since then, I've now given him more tools. Like I requested that last song that was played before the service today, I'm no longer a slave to fear. That has helped me a lot. But again, that song, the Kenny Chesney American Kids, that would play in my head before every test. And I thought, that's too funny. But I started to learn how to listen. Other things would come up. Like I would pray for something, and the next day some random photo on my phone would show up. That was exactly what I was asking for. Or I'd feel a sense of peace. And I started to learn how to listen for God in different ways because I was at a point that I had no choice but to really try. Another example of that and this whole idea of giving it to God came a few weeks later. I was at a softball game for my daughter, and I was sitting in the vehicle on oxygen, people helping me to the fields, all the things. And I had this guy that was a friend of a friend who I'd heard about who had my exact same condition. He'd had a lung transplant 2 years before, so rare I didn't personally know anyone. But I started to talk to this guy. I had him in my phone, I still do, as Bob Lung Friend. I didn't even know his last name at the time. But I was so desperate, I texted from my car in between these softball games, Bob Lung Friend, and I basically said, I think I'm gonna have to get a transplant, do you have any advice? And if I'm being honest, what I wanted him to say was everything is gonna be okay. I just wanted to hear some sort of reassurance, but that's not what he wrote back. He basically wrote back, the path you're on is gonna be hard, it's gonna have it's gonna have its challenges, but essentially he said you have to give it to God. And I remember when I read that, I was like, ugh. It's like not really what you wanna hear when you're so desperate. Looking at it now, I see the extreme wisdom in it, but I didn't at the time. But having a little bit of time and getting back up to the field where she was gonna play this game after my husband and some other people got me up to the field with my fresh oxygen tank, I remember looking at the sky and saying, okay, God, I'm gonna try to give this to you. Please help me know how to. And then again, 48 hours later, I heard the same advice. And so I had just been down that Monday to one of the craziest tests I'd ever had to do. I was in this tube and having to breathe, and it was just horrific. And I called my granny, who's pictured here on one of her last birthdays. She was nearing the end, and I didn't tell her. My mom hadn't told her that I was sick. We didn't want her to worry. But she had gone through so many things in her life that I called her, again, desperately seeking advice. And I said, hey, how did you, just give me some life advice. How did you manage through everything? And she said almost the exact same thing. She said, I learned to give it to God. And she said, it's a lot easier that way. So much wisdom in that. So I kept praying and I kept trying to do that very thing. And then I realized that I could also pray for guidance. I hadn't done that either. I think my normal prayers before were, please protect my kids, thank you for everything, those kinds of things. But I hadn't prayed for some guidance where I thought I would get an answer. But at the edge of myself, I was trying all these things. And so I had to figure out where to go get a lung transplant, no options locally, and my doctors gave me different advice because the problem was you had to balance where do they have good outcomes, what's something that maybe is not terrible to get to because you have to stay there quite a while afterwards, but most importantly, who would be willing to take you? With my underlying condition, a lot of places wouldn't take me. And so even though a lot of people will seek out St. Louis, I say a lot of people, there's a few people in Kansas City that have had a lung transplant, but I'd known somebody with my same condition who'd gotten turned down there before. So it was very hard, different people telling us different things, and so I prayed about it, and first few days, I didn't hear anything, at least not anything I heard or listened to. And then I was driving in my car, and I prayed again, and I looked up, and there was the sign. And so I told my husband, we're gonna go to St. Louis. And it was a big choice because I didn't have much time left. Things were really decelerating. And if you go there and go through the whole evaluation and wait on the appointment and they say no, you're back to square one. But I just had this peace. It's kind of if you know, you know. It wasn't a coincidence. And I knew it wasn't a coincidence. So, again, diagnosed Christmas of 21. 6 months later, I got my transplant in St. Louis. They did accept me on 7/7/22. Before, though, I got my transplant, I got a call 2 weeks prior. And they said, okay, this is the day. We go there, we do all the things, say goodbye to the kids, get the pre-op, the needles, the IVs. And they all walk in, the anesthesiologist, the surgeon, and they said, we're so sorry, Lindsey, but these lungs are not viable. That's devastating because you don't know if you're going to get another call. But I had kind of gotten good at this point, giving it to God, and I was like, okay, it's not meant to be. Take out the IV, and we went home. 2 weeks later, I get this call. I actually got the transplant, and I firmly believe that these lungs were meant for me. And then all the just creativity I see, 7/7, I was born in 77. 7 means completion and perfection in the Bible. I got 2 lungs. I was like, see, I knew this was not what was meant for me. So with that, as I close, I just have to say that faith, right, that's something just like my shirt. I carried on me, you wouldn't have known that was there. Because you have to believe things before you can see it, and that doesn't mean that everything's perfect. Things are still challenging for me. You see me out there, I'll have a mask on. I have to worry about this, that, and the other. But with faith, I'm never alone. That's the difference. And so, God being creative again, on my anniversary of 7/7/22, I looked for something fun to do to celebrate life. And guess who was coming to town? You guessed it, Kenny Chesney, on the anniversary of my transplant. Some of you are here today that went, a whole big group of us went, and when he sang that song, held up that trophy, it makes me tear up. Yes, I'm tearing up for Kenny Chesney. But as I walked in, 57,000 people were at Arrowhead that night, and who I ran into? John, my doctor, at the gate. You can't make that up. So, with that, I just want to say that we've been talking all year long about the ultimate perspective, the upper story and the lower story. The upper story, of course, being God's perspective, and the lower story being what we live and what we see. And I've learned that to just trust that we can't see everything through our own lens, and there is a greater upper story. And so I try to think about things like, I've been chosen for this story. This isn't a burden. This isn't a feel sorry for me. This is what I was chosen for. And you're equipped on your journey. I found that as well. Whenever I've needed something, it's been right there. So we're going to close with a prayer today. I'd like to pray for those who are struggling in any way to trust in their plan and the plan that was uniquely chosen for them. And I want to pray for hope, healing, and peace for anybody who needs it today. In Jesus' name, amen, and thank you.